Okay, so I will start, and even the mic is on, that's great. I'm really happy to be here and welcome. It's extremely nice to see so many people considering the whole corona situation, and that we have now about 2 prides that have been very, very different from what many of us are used to. My name is Aino, and I work as an asylum lawyer at RFSL. And I'm going to talk about, among other things, the asylum process for LGBTIQ people and RFSL's research that we published last year about the credibility assessments in these asylum cases. And I will start because I want also to give you some time to ask questions and give comments or anything that might come up during the 40 or so minutes, something like that. I want to say something about RFSL's asylum work. We do many things. We give, for example, legal advice and representation. We also do education and a lot of political work. It can be, for example, commenting on law proposals and trying to impact political parties when it comes to their voting on asylum and migration laws. And then we have newcomers, and the expert about newcomers is here, my dear colleague. And we have newcomers groups are all around Sweden, basically, and they're extremely important to asylum seekers, undocumented, newly arrived, basically migrants, and also forcefully, people who are displaced forcefully. Who didn't intend to flee, for example. It's a very important and crucial safe meeting place for people who might have left their countries of origin for different reasons. And then for me, myself, I work as an asylum lawyer at RFSL, and I've specialized in what I call SOGIESC, asylum law. And when I say SOGIESC, I mean sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics for about 9 years. And today, my aim is to give you insight both into the asylum process, the legal asylum process for LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers, and the problems and consequences of the migration authorities' assessments today. And I would love for you to have around maybe 10 to 15 minutes for questions and thoughts and anything that might be. And I also want to say that if or when you have questions about something individual, like if you know someone who is applying for asylum, if you are applying for asylum, I'm here, but please contact me on the email address or the phone, so that we don't have to take it publicly. That's best for everyone. When I talk about LGBTIQ plus persons who are applying for asylum, or when people ask about what is this about, I think it's really important for people who are interested in this to understand what are people fleeing. Why are people leaving the countries that they might be born in, for example? So I talk about something that I call LGBTIQ specific persecution. And persecution can be committed by either the state, but it can also be private individuals. The state is obviously authorities, like police authorities, and the state, it can be also that the state sanctions when private individuals commit persecution. Private individuals obviously can be one's family, it can be neighbors, it can be the community around, maybe teachers at school, or just private individuals. So when the state is committing the persecution, it's very common that countries have, for example, criminalizing laws. It can be very concrete laws about that are against and criminalizing same-sex relations. It can also be laws that very specifically target trans persons, that it is forbidden according to law to wear, so to say, the wrong gender's clothes. And when we talk about criminalizing laws, it can be anything from high fines up to imprisonment, and obviously also the death penalty. When it comes to private persecution, it can be things that the family, for example, one's own family can order other persons to commit, so to say, corrective rapes, such things. It can be people who experience being beaten, or very many different things. And this can also obviously be sanctioned by the state when it comes to police authorities and them not protecting the person from this kind of persecution. And what I find when my clients tell me their stories, but also when I read people's stories who come to RFSL for our help and advice, is that there is kind of a common motive. That is that the people committing the persecution, whether it's the state or whether it's one's family or other persons, it's that there is like a goal of curing or correcting or punishing the sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics or gender expression. And very unfortunately, at least for me, the absolute majority of persons that I meet, they have already been subjected to persecution when they come to Sweden and apply for asylum. And in these cases, when I talk to other lawyers who might have other types of cases, what I find is a bit different in LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers situations is that the persecution that they face is very severe. It's very often severe physical, psychological, and of course also sexual violence that they actually face at a deportation from Sweden. And what has happened in the last few years, I mentioned recently that I have been working with this for 9 years, but what has happened in maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 years is that I find it extremely difficult to be granted asylum in these cases when I compare it to when I started working. And for me and other lawyers who also work with these cases, I was curious because we all find that it has become so difficult, almost impossible to be granted asylum. So I wanted to find out why, which is why I wrote a research for RFSL by just simply going through over 2,000 individual decisions, but also court rulings. So it's from the migration agency, but also the migration courts, and actually also the migration court of appeal. And I found that there are some specific requirements in the credibility assessments that both the migration agency, but also the migration courts make in these asylum cases. And this is to make the sexual orientation, gender identity, and even the gender expression credible. So you have to, as an asylum seeker, make credible to the authority that, yes, I belong to this societal group, and that's why I need asylum. So the first very clear criteria that is made by the migration agency and the courts is that they actually demand that you have gone through an emotional journey of self-realization of the sexual orientation or gender identity, and even the gender expression, if that is what you claim for why you need asylum. And they also require that you have felt yourself negative feelings of difference, feeling stigma, and feeling shame. And this is very odd. They also require that the more taboo, the more stigmatized the sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression is in your country of origin, the more you have to talk about it. So the more stigmatized or the worse criminalization when it comes to LGBTIQ plus in your country of origin, the more you have to be able to talk about being LGBTIQ yourself. And I think most of us would agree that it's not logical, doesn't make any sense. The fourth very clear criteria is that the person is, they ask and they demand that the person talks about risk assessments. How did you think about risks? What did you think about risks with having a relationship? What did you think about the risks before kissing your partner in a car that was parked on your private yard and it was in the middle of the night? You must have thought about risks, and then just explain to the migration agency, for example, what did you think about the risks and how you took the risk anyway. And it can be written in a way, and this is the most commonly occurring statements in basically any rejection motivation based on credibility. It is reasonable to require that an inner process of self-realization about the SOGIESC has taken place and can be described by the applicant. This was Migration Court, I think it was 2020, so last year. Another example, you have not described what you thought about the risks before doing XXX. And XXX is usually flirting with a person, having a relationship, hugging your partner, wearing certain types of clothes, and so on and so on. And what I started thinking about when reading these more than 2,000 decisions and court rulings was that I realized that it is actually the migration authorities' definition of what is SOGIESC that is being applied to asylum seekers. And the migration authorities, the Swedish migration authorities, they obviously apply a Western definition and understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And they define it very clearly as something strictly emotional. It is about thoughts, it is about feelings, it's about emotions. And when we say someone is gay or someone is trans, it's an identity. That's how the Swedish migration authorities define it. And it is that definition that they ask the asylum seeker to describe. And the problem here is that most asylum seekers, and I dare to say most of all of us, might not define ourselves according to how they define. All of us are different. We all own the right to define ourselves and describe ourselves according to how we feel and how we are. We all own that right to define ourselves. And it is very, very common for asylum seekers from different parts of the world to describe themselves, for example, on sexual orientation, by describing physical emotions. Who am I attracted to? Who do I have sex with? Physical appearance, for example, describing gender expression when that is the reason why someone is maybe beating you up on the streets. And the problem here is that when the asylum seeker describes something physical, the migration agency and also the court will say, this is wrong. This is the wrong way of describing. You are supposed to talk about feelings and emotions. So it's the asylum seeker's asylum claim. It is them applying for asylum. It's their case, it's their life, but it's the Swedish migration authorities' definition which is applied. So when they use a very Western definition of SOGIESC, it's not applicable on most asylum seekers, and obviously there is a very, very big risk of being denied from the beginning when you don't meet the criteria of the migration agencies. I also found that there are very many other prejudiced stereotypes about LGBTIQ people that are applied in the asylum process. For example, the asylum seekers are expected to find out Swedish laws when they come to Sweden. One rejection motivation, it was also last year, that migration agency wrote to a very young, they write here man, but it was a young person. You are a well-educated man from Afghanistan who studied computer science. Therefore, you can be expected to easily find out information about your sexual orientation and the situation for homosexuals in Sweden. And this happens over and over and over again, that the migration authorities tell someone when they deny them asylum that you should have found out the laws. You came to Sweden, so you must have known the laws in Sweden. Why didn't you tell us from the beginning that you are gay or trans or a lesbian, and so on? They also expect people to use, first of all, be aware of, but also use Western LGBTIQ terminology to describe themselves. For example, I just mentioned that in the Western definition, you're expected to talk about feelings and emotions, yet this is not how so many people define themselves and describe themselves. But you're still expected to define yourself according to migration agencies' terminology, and you're supposed to know about it before even coming to Sweden. You're also expected to not only know about, but actually get involved in LGBTIQ organizations, both in the country you come from, but also in Sweden, like RFSL. And it's a bit funny because when a person does not, or when they hand in a letter from us, from RFSL, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove anyone's orientation or their gender identity, but if they don't hand in anything, they ask, why didn't you get a letter from RFSL? And then that's the reason for denying. They're also expected to have made realistic and long-term future plans. For example, an asylum seeker might say, I can never come out to my family, but I love my mother and she's the most important person in my life, and I would love for her to visit me in Sweden if I get asylum here. And then the rejection motivation would say, you haven't been able to explain how you're going to make it work with your mother coming to Sweden for 1 week or 2, yet you don't want her to find out. And the applicant has said, well, I'm going to have my partner outside of the house for the days that my mother is here. All LGBTIQ plus applicants are expected to have this internalized self-hatred, to feel LGBTIQ phobia and shame. Remember, that was the one criteria that they make in the very beginning of the asylum process. You're supposed to feel shame. And for people who say that they might be believers or that they might be religious, they expect there to be this kind of inner conflict between being an LGBTIQ plus person and, for example, believing in God. And people who say, well, for me, I believe that God created me the way I am, that is not accepted. That is an automatic, you are not credible. And the point here is that all of these are unlawful and obviously untrue stereotypes about LGBTIQ plus people, because they assume that all of us, all over the world, we have same experiences, we have same thoughts, feelings, and ways of talking, behaving. We've all gone through some sort of inner emotional journey that looks the same across the world, and that these things can be examined by Swedish state authorities to find out and determine who is a genuine LGBTIQ person. And obviously, this is going to lead to persons being excluded when they don't have these experiences. And there are many other unlawful rejections that I unfortunately found in the research. For example, one is what we in asylum law call discretion reasoning. In Swedish, we call it diskretionskrav. This is cut out from the research, so it's why it's in Swedish. But it basically means that the migration authorities have rejection motivations where they write directly or indirectly that the person can hide their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. For example, Migration Agency wrote in a decision from December 2019 to a young, I would say child, from Morocco, regardless of the fact that you identify as bisexual, you have lived according to the norm in Morocco, which you can continue to do at a return. This is as illegal as it gets. It doesn't get more unlawful than this. These type of reasonings, they have been unlawful according to Swedish law for over 15 years. And it has been unlawful in international law for around 10 years. And what was shocking to me is that I found these type of motivations in cases up to 53%. And this shocked me, 53%. And there were cases from countries like Iraq, Kenya, Tunisia, Morocco, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Jordan, many cases from Lebanon and Russia. And what is common for these countries, where in most cases, the migration authorities didn't question that the person was LGBTIQ+, or that they, for example, had same-sex relationships. And all of these countries, they have criminalizing laws in the sense that they have everything from fines up to life imprisonments and anal tests, which the UN has classified as torture, and they even have death penalty in some of these countries. And for example, this young person from Morocco who had lived according to the norm, it appears very, very natural for someone who is living in an environment like this young person who had described, I risk death. My family is threatening me and beating me every single day. I cannot do anything but to live discreet and hide my gender identity and my sexual orientation. Who wouldn't do that? I also found, which I also found shocking, considering the migration agency's own legal guidelines, but also the Migration Court of Appeal that has actually set straight just a few years ago that these are different asylum grounds. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, they are totally different things. They're totally different legal grounds for asylum. And this is clear in international law and in Swedish law. For example, gender expression is a very, very common reason why someone risks persecution. It can be a person whom the people around, like the family, for example, they see the person as a boy, as a man, and the person might wear makeup or might wear painting, they might be painting their nails, or someone that the people around them, they might say, this is a woman, and the person has a way of walking or a hairstyle or something that the people around them say, this is not okay for how a woman is supposed to be in our culture. This is extremely common. So this would be an asylum reason apart from, for example, the sexual orientation or the gender identity. But I found that the migration authorities very often wrongfully confuse the gender expression as being part of the sexual orientation, which is obviously wrong. And the problem here is that the migration authorities' own ignorance and their wrongful assessments, it leads to that they say, you have not made credible your sexual orientation. And I've even seen decisions where someone who described their gender identity very, very clearly and even gave in evidence, like showing gender-affirming treatment, letters from doctors, and so on. But still, the migration authorities wrote, you have not made credible your transsexual orientation. And this obviously means that trans asylum seekers are assessed wrongly, or their asylum grounds are not assessed at all. They are just missed in the process. And obviously, in several cases, I found that this has led to wrongful rejections, and that the deportations are carried out to countries that actually enforce the death penalty. I also found, and know from my own experience as a lawyer in these cases, that what we call subjective speculations, they are systematic. They happen all the time. I dare to say that for me, I've not been in one single asylum interview where there are no subjective assumptions and speculations about how an LGBTIQ person should be and which experiences they should have. Because even when we enter the room and they ask the question, tell me about your emotional journey, that already assumes that someone has gone through an emotional journey, and all of us, we haven't. It's not something you can always assess and think that this is something that everyone has gone through. And also, there are no uniform assessments. A few examples, and this was one of my own cases. where we had the asylum interview for about 2.5 hours, which is quite normal, or 3 hours in these cases. And we were just wrapping up. The interview was about to finish. And the case officer just asks from nowhere, by the way, you said you were 16, 17 years when you realized that you were homosexual. That's a rather late age to realize your emotions as a homosexual in Bangladesh, said to my client. And me, as a public counsel, I feel obviously furious, but also a bit of panic. Should I intervene? But the interview is wrapping up, and I just know that this is bad. And this is not an objective question. This is a statement with a personal speculation or a thought from the case officer, who is obviously very ignorant. But this happens all the time, all the time. Another example, which was also one of my own cases, and this was written in a negative decision to another, at the time, unaccompanied minor, so a child from Uganda. Your information that your father was ashamed of you and wanted the police to arrest you is contradicting. If he was ashamed of you, he should not want to spread information about your homosexuality to the police or the Ugandan media. I mean, I have had countless of clients and also other persons coming to RFSL who seek asylum, who are from Uganda. And so many of them explain and say that when their parents or family members or a friend or a neighbor find out that they are LGBTIQ+, the first thing that they might do is go to the police. Because you might be even forced by the law to report someone who you suspect is, for example, gay. And you might go to the media also. And this all is a way of showing the environment, I don't accept this. I don't accept my homosexual child, like in this client's case. It was a way, like in so many other cases I've had, it was a way for a family member to show the neighbors, because they don't also want to get attacked, that I don't accept this, I will go to the police and I will report my kid, as a way of showing that I'm not okay with it. And it's the reason why the person left the country in the first place. And I'm thinking, did the case officer and decision maker, did they not read the country information? Are they not interested? There is no contradiction here, like the migration agency is wrongfully claiming. And again, this happens over and over and over. We have cases where they are the exact same circumstances. There might be identical asylum stories. There's the same evidence. For example, the identical country reports. Lebanon is a very good example of that. You can have two parts of the same court that make the exact opposite assessments based on the same country reports. And the same day, two different asylum seekers from this country get different opposite decisions. One gets refugee status and gets to stay in Sweden, the other one gets denied and gets a decision about deportation based on the same country reports that different judges just interpret differently. And this also happens all the time. If you remember, I said before that one criteria is that people don't take risks. You're not supposed to take risks as an LGBTIQ person. And at least you have to explain, why did you take risks? How did you think about them? But when a person, for example, says, I have not been engaged in RFSL or something equivalent to RFSL in my country of origin, that is usually not seen as credible. But when the person says, I saw, for example, a few cases from Kenya, where lesbian women had fled to Uganda and there sought help from Ugandan LGBTIQ organizations, then that was not believed. Because how could you take such a risk? How could you take such a risk to go to an LGBTIQ organization in Uganda when you know that it's criminalized there to be a lesbian? So you understand, whatever you say it can be used, it can and it will be used against you. I also found very strange cases where an applicant says very clearly that their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristics, that this is the reason why I need protection. But that the migration authorities they don't assess it. They just skip it. And I thought this cannot happen in Sweden. But then I had a case of my own with a very young person from Somalia, and the person had gotten denied many years back, and this was a new asylum assessment. So it has to be, the migration authorities, they are obliged to look into everything, all the asylum grounds. And then we sit at the interview, and the case officer tells me and my client, we are not going to assess the LGBTIQ claims. And I was like, what? Whoa, what is happening? Is this serious? Is this for real? Is this happening in 2020? In that case, I and other lawyers consulted each other, and I think we worked like 2 months, almost around the clock, because it was around Christmas and they went to vacation, and it ended up by RFSL's chairperson writing their name on a letter publicly to the migration agency, the same letter I had already written to the case officer, their bosses, the team leaders, and so on. And after our chairperson signed their name on the letter, it took 20 minutes. And then I got an email, come back for an interview, we are going to examine the LGBTIQ reasons. This is what you're working with. And obviously, all of this is unlawful, not only in Swedish law, but also in international law. Because, for example, in EU law, it is stated so clearly, and in UNHCR's guidelines, you have the right to an objective and individual assessment. And the problem when you use stereotypes and these kind of subjective statements and whatever the case officer thinks, it's not objective. And you don't make an individual assessment based on what is the person before me telling me what happened to them and why they cannot go back. And this is completely against fundamental principles about predictability and unity, and they are not fulfilled in Sweden when the authorities here are assessing LGBTIQ asylum cases. And the consequences, as I mentioned before, are that we now have what I would say, and what the research clearly shows, sadly, that we have systematic wrongful rejections and deportations to countries where we know that these persons risk persecution and, in worst case, torture and death. And this is just a very tragic fact in Sweden. Just briefly, before I want to open up for questions, other challenges that LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers face. Obviously, it is quite common that many might not even know that their sexual orientation or gender identity, gender expression, that it is an asylum ground that is recognized by Swedish law. They might not mention it, which also lead to that they are not believed once they do mention it, which is also against Swedish and international law. People have the right to choose a lawyer, but this is not something that they are always informed about, even though they should be informed about it. Many lawyers don't meet their clients, which is also always going to be devastating for the case. There are interpreters that might not use correct or respectful language. And obviously, many persons, as I mentioned, most people have already been subjected to some kind of persecution. And they have past trauma, they might suffer from PTSD, which always affects your ability to talk, especially when it's before people you've never met before and you might not be prepared for what's coming. And this has to be assessed also by the authorities, but I find that very often they might not even examine if the person has been subjected to torture, which they have to do, but I find that it doesn't always happen. There is always the risk of being subjected to violence and threats in the accommodations, which is a problem that we at RFSL see all the time. There is also a big lack of knowledge about and access to, for example, that RFSL exists. And I have heard that this is something that the migration agency should inform the asylum seekers about, that RFSL exists and you can get help. But it doesn't always happen. I've met so many people just today say, no, I never knew, no one told me, and until it was too late, when I already had 1, 2, 3, 5 rejections. There is also not a right to begin gender-affirming treatment for trans asylum seekers. And there is obviously always going to be a huge risk for a wrongful negative decision when the person doesn't have the right experiences or the right way to talk about them, according to the migration authorities. And of course, I have to somehow try to be a bit positive at the end. So I do want to give some kind of tips to both asylum seekers, but obviously also allies. You really need to have someone who is specialized as a lawyer. I said in my previous talk with asylum seekers and former asylum seekers that it is extremely important to meet your lawyer before the interview. This is going to be crucial. And I really stand by my statement that not all lawyers should be working with human rights law and asylum law. You might want to just consider doing finance law and tax law, and don't mix it up with asylum law because it's a whole other field. Contact or refer to RFSL for legal and social support. We are in different parts of the country, and we are here to help in any way that we can. And be active in your own asylum case. Gather evidence, screenshots, medical or other reports, support letters, photos, anything can be used as evidence in Swedish law. And if there is violence or threats in the camps, for example, or out on the streets in Sweden, document everything. Make a police report, change accommodation, and all of this can actually help your asylum case because it is evidence supporting that you are an LGBTIQ plus person. Practice talking, describing yourself, because until this changes within the migration authorities, you still need to practice before going to an interview, which is sad, but it's still the fact. Stop the asylum interview if something isn't working. If the case officer is asking questions in an offensive way, if they're not being objective, if the translation is not working, just stop the interview. It's your interview, it is your case, it is your life which is at stake. And if it's a negative decision, you need to contact a lawyer to look into are there new circumstances. For example, I can help at RFSL or refer to someone who is really good in these cases. And in the meantime, some hopeful message that I would love to just share before ending. We hope that things are about to change. We do have a dialogue with the Swedish Migration Agency. They are aware with the research, and so far they have not had any opinions or so against it, or they seem to agree with all of it. So we are really hoping that they keep their promise that changes are going to happen. Thank you very, very much, and I would love to open up for questions or thoughts. Yes?
Okay, basically I have 2 questions. The first one is that my first question is that you mentioned recently, in like 5-6 years, you said it's become more difficult to get refugee status. So I was wondering, do you think this is because they have changed their process or theories that they based, their frameworks, or is it rather a political decision that they want to make Sweden less attractive, for immigration? Which one do you think it is?
Thank you for the question, and I think it's a really important question that I get quite often. And I have not written this in the research that we published because it wasn't relevant, because it was a legal research. But obviously, me and other lawyers who work in these cases feel that this part of it is political. Because when Sweden made a decision that now we need less people to come here, we want to make it as bad as possible so that people don't come here. One lawyer colleague of me said that I felt that it changed in one day. Because the next day when I went to an interview, I feel that my client is being interrogated like a criminal. And I also feel this. This didn't used to happen. I would say 99% of my clients got positive decisions. And I didn't need to do much. I just met them, I listened to their story, and I supported them in the interview. Today, you need a lawyer who is extremely much aware and very good at these cases, who sits with you maybe 5 hours, 2 days, maybe a week, to train you before an interview. That's ridiculous. But it's because things have changed. And I also believe and have heard people say that the most experienced, for example, case officers at the migration agency, many of them have left. And some of them have said to me, because of the climate isn't good. The working environment isn't good. So I think it's a mix of many things. The political environment changing, the society changing, becoming more hostile to immigrants, to refugees. It's a mix, it's a combination of all those things. Racism increasing, and so on and so on. So I really believe that it's a mix, because the law, when it comes to these asylum grounds, it hasn't changed. Even the method that the migration agency uses and applies, it hasn't changed. So it's not that. It basically, when I sit in an interview, I always feel that they're just looking for a reason to say, not credible, contradicting, and you're like, this isn't contradicting. Or when they tell someone, you haven't talked about feelings and emotions in enough detail, and someone is like, the person sat for 4 hours and talked about feelings and emotions in detail. This is, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. So really, I think it's a horrible combination, and I just pray that it changes. And we are doing everything we can, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question. So in this presentation, you mentioned some of the problems and weaknesses that they use in the process, and I've been personally through this process, so I've seen it firsthand. But my question is, okay, so we know they have problem, like stereotypes, subjectivity that you mentioned, but what's the solution here? Because in most of the panels that I've been, they always talk about the problems, okay? So my question directly to you is that if today Immigration Office asks you for advice, how would you change this process? Because I think we agree there should be a process and framework, because otherwise, if they say yes to everyone, the people are going to misuse this. So how would you change this? I mean, what's the correct way to see if someone is in the minority or not? Thank you.
And this is the question that at least lawyers find like the most important, because it really is. I would say the problem, and not only me, we are actually so many lawyers in different countries who also communicate with each other, because we see this problem happening in so many countries that also use stereotypes in the credibility assessments. And we was it now 2 months ago, it was 3 weeks in June, the UNHCR, yes, I'm looking at the clock, the UNHCR had their second ever global round table, where we actually got to discuss these very problems in the credibility assessments. And many of us have done research in our organizations and as lawyers, and we all agree that the use of stereotypes has to end. And the UNHCR, they have guidelines that is basically, it's Swedish law. So it's what the migration agency and the courts look at. And in that global roundtable for 3 weeks. When it came to an end, they actually said, we're going to look over and like assess the UNHCR guidelines and see what needs to change, because they listened to what all of us were saying from many different countries. So this is a really positive thing. And the use of stereotypes and specific models, Western models of sexuality and gender and so on, they should not be there. And I think there is a really big consensus in many countries that we need to get rid of them. So that is what we are looking forward to the UNHCR also listening to. And obviously it will impact directly the migration authorities in Sweden. I can talk about this for 5 hours because it's, yeah. But if there are any other questions, because I know I'm 1 minute over time, I would love to answer them one-on-one or, yeah. Otherwise, thank you very, very, very much for coming here. And I have visit cards if anyone wants to ask about a specific case or situation, so I'm here. But otherwise, thank you very much.